Just did, yep.
All right. Yeah, no problem, Jamie. Pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm actually going to stop my captions because it's distracting me as well. So done that. So welcome everybody. So this, if you were at the Remote Teaching Institute last summer, this is a presentation I did during that session, and it's one I've actually done a number of times, both when I was the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Brockport, but also at a number of open educational resource course design workshops that myself and Alexis Clifton, who works at Geneseo, who used to work for OER Services, did across the state. And I'll give a credit to the person or the people who actually came up with this presentation and who were generous enough to allow me to continue to use it and Creative Commons licensed it so that I could do that. And so today we're going to talk about creating your student learning goals. The other thing I'll say about this presentation is that it's actually designed to be a longer, like a 2-hour workshop, not an hour workshop. So I'll end with the kind of work that you'll need to do following the workshop, and with the promise that if you'd like, I could certainly give you feedback on what you come up with via email. So you'll see in the last slide that I've given my email address. It's there on the screen too, and I'm happy to give anybody feedback on what they come up with in terms of their learning goals for their course or courses after the workshop is over. So here are our goals for this session. The first goal we'll kind of get out of the way pretty quickly. You hear a lot about these days, obviously, if you're involved in assessment, you hear a lot about learning objectives, learning outcomes. They all have to be in your syllabi, and you have to do assessment around them. And they come up very frequently these days if you're teaching in higher education. But we're going to talk about goals. And so I'm just going to take a little bit of time just to say what I mean by that and how they differ from learning objectives and outcomes. And then for the most of the presentation, we're going to look at what student-centered learning goals look like. So we'll have lots of examples and a process for actually coming up with learning goals that are flexible, learner-centered, and in alignment with what those in your discipline do. So like I said, as promised, this presentation was adapted with permission from this workshop, Designing Effective and Innovative Courses. I provided the link there. Jamie, if you want to put it in the chat, that's fine. But if you just search for cutting edge course design tutorial in Google, you'll find it. It was I think an NSF grant funded project from almost 20 years ago now that Barb Tewksbury and Heather McDonald from Hamilton College and College of William and Mary got, and they put this tutorial together. And it was they've updated it since, but initially it was in the early days of the internet. So it was very text heavy and very kind of linear, old school kind of website. Like I said, I believe it's been updated since then, but the content of their tutorial, what they call a tutorial, which is really just a process for designing your courses. And so it's not just about designing course goals, and that's why I provided the link here, but it really is a process for designing a whole course, redesigning a whole course. And it was designed for courses in the geosciences, but frankly, it could be used for any course in any discipline. Just some of the examples are kind of limited to the geosciences, but not all of them. So if you're designing a whole course and you're looking for a free, open source, Creative Commons license method for doing that, it's pretty straightforward. I recommend you search it out and maybe go through the whole process. And like I said, it's designed to be able to do on your own. So it's better if you do it with colleagues and get feedback, but or an instructional designer or somebody in your campus who can help with that. But you could also just do it on your own if you'd like as well. So I'm going to start out with a question, and I'm going to ask you all to maybe put in the chat. Thinking back to either when you were a novice teacher, or perhaps you work with colleagues who are novice teachers, or you've reviewed courses of novice teachers. And now I'm not talking about teachers that maybe went to, got a lot of educational background in graduate school or had experience teaching before they started teaching classes. I'm talking about your sort of average novice teacher. how do they design their courses and assess student learning? And you could just put in the chat and I'll kind of just read it out as we go along. All right, so let's see, I'm gonna blow up my screen here a bit. However they experienced it in school. Yep, Susan. Following the chapters in the textbook, Diane, yes. Cut and paste from my professors. I admit my very first syllabus was pretty much a exact copy of the course I took. It was actually a grad course. I had to kind of pare it down a bit for an undergraduate course, and it was right from one of my professors. Yep, borrowed syllabi. And, I think borrowing syllabi is probably the best approach because, why make things up on your own if someone else has done it, as long as you get their permission, right? Chapter to chapter, tests and quizzes are the way, people typically will assess their students' learning initially, right? Midterm and final, good old midterm and final. And thankfully that seems to be changing these days, and the pandemic really led to a lot of change in that area. Cut and paste the table of context from a textbook, borrow from an advisor. Okay, repeat what we learned. We teach typically as we were taught. Textbooks. All right. Okay, so you all are kind of thinking along the lines of what I have on this slide here, as you'll see in a second. So, oh, there we go. So yeah, so you all pretty much came up with this already, but here's the way I've summarized it on this slide, right? So you're making a list of content items important to coverage of the field. I've got to, and this again, thankfully is changing now, but, the coverage of the topic is usually the content was out front. Right. And that was the thing that you said, oh, I have to cover X, Y, and Z. And this is true, I think, of all disciplines, both humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences, right? You have to cover it. And if there's certain things you just have to cover. Oh, how could you have a course on, American politics if you don't cover the Constitution, right? And while that may be true, it sort of doesn't tell you anything about the Constitution, just that it has to be covered. And then, once you have all the fields, items, the content items, you organize the syllabus according to the topics, right? So when am I going to cover the US Constitution? When am I going to cover the elections of 1896 or something like that, right? And you kind of put it all together. Maybe you do it chronologically, linearly, or maybe you do it some other way, but that's the next big step. And then finally you say, all right, how am I going to now tell my students about this content? And, lectures, how am I going to develop my lectures? And maybe I'll have some discussions too, so they can talk about the brilliant things I say to them, or maybe they can actually go in labs and try out the things that I teach them if it's a science class. And then you just test whether or not how well they did it, right? And so you can see the appeal to this. And I know most of the people who are here today, probably don't do this, or do it, maybe do it a little bit, but, have really kind of gone beyond this. And most people today and teaching in higher ed have gone beyond this, but, it's seductive because it is so straightforward and simple. And it really does kind of reduce teaching and learning to a very like linear, easy to follow format. So why have we all kind of moved past this? Maybe some suggestions in the chat as well. What's going on here? And I'm going to jump down to the chat. What's wrong with this model? What's missing? Right? What's the point? The purpose of all this content? David, Susan, where's the learning in all this? Jamie, yep. How is it engaging? How is it relevant to students? And Nancy, right? Student engagement, discernment. All right. Student enjoyment of learning content, right? Yeah. Who cares if they enjoy it, right? They just got to learn it. Eat your vegetables. They're good for you. Maureen, yeah. Application to students' goals. Where do students fit in here? And how to put the material together into proper thinking about the topic, right? So it's not just about the content, it's how the content hangs together, the connections, the way to kind of building those, helping students build those connections. Connecting to the real world, yep. Access, certainly, right? So it doesn't really, it kind of goes, the access piece kind of goes along to how does it relate to students in your class, right? So, how are students going to connect to it? It sort of assumes that students are all the same. Right? Synthesis of the information, application to learning, content overwhelm. can be an issue. I mean, that was the biggest problem when I first started teaching, was I just tried to shove too much into the course. I had a friend who used to say something, and I'm going to get the phrase wrong, but it's like, 10 pounds of potatoes in a 2-pound sack or something like that. I know I probably messed it up a little bit, but that's what you'd always try to do. Oh, I just want to get this one book in, or this one article, and that, and we get so in love with our content that we overwhelm our students. And yeah, critical thinking and disciplinary thinking. Good, Melanie and Diane. All right, so as I figured, you all kind of did a pretty good job with guessing what's on my slide here. But I could probably add to this from a lot of what you all said there, but what are they going to do with this information when the course is over? I mean, the novice teacher, the kind of very that basic way of designing a course almost assumes that students are going to be what are they going to do? They're most likely not going to be political scientists, biologists, whatever it is you teach when the course is over, right? So, but oftentimes under this model, you almost assume that that's what's going to happen, or they're going to be professional students in your discipline, which, some maybe do that, but most don't, right? So that model doesn't really say what you're going to do with all the things that you're learning. And that goes along the lines with, what beyond just content coverage, what goals do you have for your students? What do you want them to accomplish with what they're learning? And then that's final bullet, right? Student learning and problem solving and critical thinking and all the things you said in the chat. What are they going to do? What are they going to do with all this stuff, right? And from their perspective and not from your perspective. So, right. So it's basically taking the learner-centered perspective and it's ignoring the learning-centered perspective. And what we want to do is take that learner-centered perspective. And that's what this process does. This goals-based approach takes that perspective and emphasizes that courses should be designed where students learn significant and appropriate content and skills. So content doesn't go away in this model, right? I like the sort of model of, I like food metaphors when it comes to teaching and learning. And so to me, if you use a food metaphor in teaching and learning, your content is like your ingredients in making a meal, right? So, if you want to make a good meal, you have to have really good ingredients. So your content does matter. It matters a lot. You're not going to accomplish anything with the best written goals if the students don't have good enough content to, meet those goals or achieve those goals, right? So your content matters, but what matters just as much is how you put it all together, what kind of things you design for them so they can practice thinking for themselves and solving problems in the discipline using that content. So that when they leave the class, they have something that they can actually use when the course is over and beyond just memorizing content, right? So, and so that should be always the goal of any goal you have for your students in the course. What are they going to do with what they learn when the course is over? Not just passing tests. All right, so I've teased at what we mean by goals. And if you came to this presentation or when you heard me say earlier that I was going to talk about the differences between objectives and outcomes and goals, I'm going to cheat a little bit and I'm actually going to sidestep it. And I'm going to say that I answered the question when I really didn't. In fact, I'm just not even going to talk about objectives or outcomes at all. If you're involved in assessment, you probably know the distinction already. But all I want to say to you is that the importance of the distinctions between these three areas depends on the context in which they are used. So in assessment context, yes, it's very important to say what your learning objectives are versus what your learning outcomes are, and what maybe your learning goals are. But what I'm going to tell you right now, when you're designing a course, I want you to kind of just not worry about that. And I think, to me, and this is what really appealed to me about this model of course design when I heard it from Barb Tewksbury when she came to the workshop at Brockport in like 2007, I think, is that goals are very simple to understand, right? It kind of gets us out of all the edu-speak, and it's something we all know, right? And so I went to the place where we all know where the knowledge of everything exists, right? Wikipedia. And here's the definition of what a goal is in Wikipedia. it's, something that a desired result that either you or a group of people plan to commit and achieve. And then the best part of goals, though, is that idea of a finite time by setting deadlines, right? So goals are things that are time bound, things that and just like our courses are time bound. There's only so much you can accomplish with your students in 14 weeks. And so therefore your goals need to be concrete and measurable. And my goal is to not gain more than 3 pounds during my vacation or more than 20 pounds during the pandemic. Although I think for many of us, we probably didn't necessarily meet that goal. All right, I see somebody posted something in the chat there. Oh, Jamie put the definition and the link in the chat. Thanks, Jamie. So, so anyway, it's again simple, and I'm not going to say that learning objectives and outcomes, those aren't important. They are, especially when it comes to assessment. But if you're just designing a course, I think if we just focus on goals, we can all be on the same page and we know what we're talking about. I'm going to pause there. See if there's something else in the chat. Oh, there you go, Jamie. All right. So, sorry. Skip ahead there for a second.
Chris, Susan just asked a question in the chat.
Sure.
After you checked. So she has a question about amount of content. As far as the amount of content, is there a differentiation between basic courses, concept and term heavy, versus advanced courses that are more application heavy?
So all I'm going to say about that question right now, let's put a pin in it, Susan, because it probably will come up a little bit later as you start to think about your course. And actually, I should have said this at the outset. I'd like you all to have a course in mind as you go through this. So ideally, if you were doing this workshop, you would have that course in hand and that you would be designing a goal for. So maybe just think about, for the rest of the presentation, one course. So, and what I'm going to say to you right now, Susan, is that in terms of coming up with goals, yeah, of course, your goals for your, more introductory course are going to be different than your courses, your more advanced courses, right? Your more advanced courses, students are going to either be maybe preparing for graduate school or preparing for work as a professional in that field, right? Especially if they're majors. So you're going to have more ambitious goals for those students. But the one thing I will say, though, is that you can design these types of learner-centered goals for students regardless of what course they're in. So your lower division courses or your introductory courses don't necessarily have to fall into that content teacher-centered trap. You can design equally student learning-centered goals for introductory courses as you can for your more advanced courses. Great question. Okay, so as I said, we've already accomplished our first goal, in my estimation. Some of you may be not super happy with my explanation of what the difference is here, but just for the purpose of this, we're just going to think about goals. We're going to try to put objectives and outcomes out of your head right now, and we're just going to focus on coming up with student-centered learning goals for your courses. So, all right, so let's talk about what they look like. All right, so here's the process that we'll follow for the remainder of the session in the last 40 minutes or so. So first, you have, before you think about your goals, if you're going to do anything learner-centered, you have to think about your learners, and you have to think about the context in which your course takes place. And you have to, because that, again, that's the first step. You have to know the lay of the land, right? And then only after you do that, can you start to set your overarching goals. So here's step one. And again, now get a course in mind, one that you're either designing or redesigning, or one that you teach all the time that maybe you haven't even thought about redesigning, but something that you want to kind of focus on. And think about these questions. Who are your students? What do they need? What are their needs of the curriculum, right? So this is now, if your course is an introductory course or it's a capstone course, these are the things that you need to factor in. And then what are the constraints? And now constraints, now this is where this institute kind of comes into play. Instructional modality is the one that you'll all think about. So yesterday, I know Jamie asked you all in the first session, if you were there, what modality you'll be teaching in the majority of your courses: asynchronous online, synchronous online, high flex, hybrid, face-to-face with an online supplement, or some of you may just be teaching mostly just face-to-face in the fall. So think about that and how that, and we call them constraints, but it could be, it's opportunities as well. So there are constraints and opportunities to everything, right? And then your support structure. So who can you turn to in your campus to help you with your course? And so I've given you, rather than doing this in the chat, what I'd like you to do is, and Jamie, if you could just put this link in the chat right now, there's a Google Doc there. All I ask, and I would like you all to make a copy of this for yourself. So when you go to the Google Doc, don't write in the one that's there. Just go to make a copy and create your own. Thanks, Jamie. So actually, maybe I'll just click on it just to show you how you would do that. So I'm going to click on that. So as you are all clicking into it, if you go here, you go File, make a copy.
Chris,
And then
your
just create a copy.
screen hasn't changed from your.
Oh yeah, because I was sharing my PowerPoint. Okay, well, let me do that then, just to show you all what I'm doing here. You share. And most of you know this already. So just go to File, make a copy, and create your own copy to write in. Don't write in this one because this is like the master copy. So, all right, so why don't we I'm going to give you all about 5 minutes to work through some of these questions. And as you see there, every question has a challenges and opportunities section. So let's start. I'm going to give you actually 6 minutes for this. So it's 10:24. So we'll go until 10:30.
Someone is an anonymous otter in there. That made me excited. Who wins that?
All right, so there's about 1 minute left. If you've kind of gone through the questions yourself, the next thing I'm going to ask you to do, just to kind of report out, is if in the chat you could maybe talk about some of the challenges and opportunities that your course presents. And you could just do, oops, sorry, back. Oops. You could just say challenge, and then say a few things, opportunity, and say a few things in the chat. And I'll know folks are done when I start to see you posting in the chat. All right, so if you could start putting in the chat what a challenge or an opportunity or both. Small class, yeah. I teach pretty much, I don't like to brag about this, but most of my classes are, 6 to sometimes 15. And you're right, in a small class, you really can give them opportunity to show what they're learning and individualize it more. And then David has the opposite issue, right? 150 students is a lot of students. But their number of good students in the class, right? That's always good. Yeah. Having peer learning in a large class is essential, or peer mentoring. Yeah, so actually this is an interesting challenge, right? So Benjamin notes, need to get agreement from the dean as to the course learning objectives. So one of the things about this approach that I usually tell people, this model of course design and coming up with course goals, is that it can exist alongside whatever the mandated learning objectives you have from your department or your discipline or whatever. I look at these goals as the goals that you have for your students. And obviously they shouldn't be contradictory to the official sets of learning objectives that you're required to put for your course, but they can kind of specify and be more personal to who you are as a teacher and what you want your students to get out of your course. And so I don't look at these as necessarily anything that you would you may need to, depending on your context, get approval to put something like this on your syllabus. At the end of the semester, I want students to be able to do X, Y, or Z. But, what I've seen people do is say, departmental learning objectives required for this course, and they put that on the syllabus. And then maybe below that in the course description, they say, you kind of, again, personalize that. For me, this means I want you to be able to do X, Y, and Z. And so I'm really glad you brought that up, because I don't necessarily think that, we should limit ourselves to what we're required to do, right? I think courses are a lot more fun when you can make them kind of personal to who you are and what you want. And again, that comes with a disclaimer of making sure that, whoever it is that your department chair or dean or whoever is cool with that, but I can't see why they wouldn't be. All right, online equity around video instructions demos, right? Okay, definitely. Yeah, and so that's a big issue and challenge, right? We've realized in the past year is online equity. And once we start to kind of open things up around assessments and doing things online, we have to think very carefully about how equitable our technology is to our students. Check textbook prices, right? Opportunity, more OERs. And so I don't know if Tony DeFranco's here, but if you go to the OER services website, there are tons of OER out there. And that's one of the reasons why we had offered this workshop as part of these OER workshops, is because, a lot of people got really stuck in, the the textbooks that they use for years and years, the publisher textbooks, and we thought, okay, well, how do we get them unstuck out of that? Well, let's think about redesigning your course for OER and sort of taking that step back and then trying to match the OER content to your learning goals rather than trying to match the OER content to your publisher content, right? So let's see other challenges here. Times, long days. Okay. Yeah. Wow. For a 5-week course summer, if you're taking a summer course, always a challenge to have, long 3 time a week long courses and really balancing that sort of activity. Can't be all activities in 3 hours, but it also can't be all lecture or as well. You have to kind of mix things up when you have a concentrated time like that. Okay. All right. Opportunity working in groups. Challenge is an advanced required course with an enormous course content and I approach with a practical application to the profession. So there are certain courses where there just is more content and there's no way getting around it, right? And I recognize that. Although I've been in workshops where people say, just cut. You don't think you can cut things, but you can. There's this guy, Craig Nelson, University of Indiana, who did a workshop for us at Brockport, and he would just say, take the content you think your students should know and cut it in half. And now again, that's not practical for everyone, but he would insist that there are things you can cut. And he said, if you want your students to really learn it, you need to there needs to be less. And if you try to stuff them too full of content, they're just not going to learn any of it. And so when in doubt, cut. Again, that's just a simple suggestion that probably for some of you isn't practical. All right, these are really good. I'm not going to have the chance to. I will make sure I save the chat and check these out later, since I want to get to some of the guidance about how to actually create your learning goals. So thank you. I will definitely check these out later. All right, so step 2. Setting student-focused overarching goals, right? So we can't do our students' learning for them. I remember when I had this epiphany when I was a new teacher, right? You could teach all you want, you can lecture all you want, but you can't do the students' learning for them. They ultimately have to learn, right? And so just saying you taught it doesn't mean they learn it. So just exposing them to things is really kind of besides the point. They actually have to learn it for it to matter at all. And we know when students learn. There's lots of research around the value of active learning and actively engaging in practical activities as you're learning and doing problem solving and critical thinking. And so you need to set your course goals for your students and not for you and what you think they ought to know, but what practically they can learn and how you will do that, help them do that. So here are just some examples, right? The basic survey of art from a particular period with 1, enabling students to do X, Y, and Z, go to an art museum, evaluate a technique of unfamiliar work, evaluate an unfamiliar work in its historical context or context of a artistic genre, school, or style. Biology, how you might write a student's focused overarching goal in biology rather than just surveying topics. All right, so being able to evaluate claims in the popular press, say if it's a course for non-majors, right? We all believe that that's an important goal, right? Or seek out evaluate information and make informed decisions about issues involving genetically engineered crops. So you see there's this relevance to student-focused overarching goals that may be missing in a more sort of simple content coverage type of a goal. And in terms of education, rather than a survey of the results of research, okay, how do we enable students to design activities for students? So the common denominator to all those goals, right, is that it kind of thinks about what people do in their disciplines, right? What it is that you do as a physicist, as an art historian, as a historian, as an English professor, and challenges you to think about, okay, now I'm not expecting my students to become professional physicists, art historians, English professors, but I want them to be able to do things that look somewhat like what they do at a developmentally appropriate level for your students, depending upon, again, the level of the course and all the context and constraints that you just listed in the previous activity. So we're not going to take a lot of time for this, but I just want you to think about this. You can go to that that's the next worksheet that I'm providing for the workshop. And the first part of that worksheet talks about this question in the context of the topic of your course. What do you do? What does analyze, evaluate, involve mean for you? Or alternatively, you could think about what is unique about your worldview, the view of your discipline, especially if it's a more maybe humanities course where it's more about, thinking through a text or a close reading of a text. What makes the approach of your discipline and your course unique? So I'll just give you all about, I don't know, a minute or two to think about that. And if you'd like to share in the chat, that would be cool. I like that, David. And that does sound like a really cool assignment, Pamela. Yeah, Maria, I think it's a good point. Some of us do teach courses that and disciplines that do lend themselves a little bit more to relevant experience and things like going out in the world. And some of you, this may be a challenge, but I don't know. I mean, I always think it's always interesting to me when someone from what seems to be a really academic discipline comes up with, okay, well, this is how this can be practically useful or relevant for those who don't actually study it professionally. But yeah, definitely. Interesting. So Paula, I assume you study educational administration. That's interesting. And so one thing, not to pick on you, Paula, but one thing I would be curious about is say a student took your class and they think they're going to be an administrator and then they decide not to. What would they learn beyond that, right? What kind of skills are they getting, or what kind of thing are they able to do that maybe would be useful to them, even if they don't end up in the occupation that they're actually taking the course to attend. And that, again, that may be challenging for some courses, but the idea here is that to think as broadly as possible and think about the application of skills as broadly as possible, and try to think what are the skills that makes what you do useful for everyone. And I think that most courses, if not all, probably there are some there, even those outside of the gen ed curriculum. Just the ability to, in math and mathematical economics, I'm looking at Marx here. Yeah, they may not solve any of those problems, but they can discuss the ideas intelligently, right? So how, and then the next thing I would ask you there, if we were sitting down in the workshop, I'd say, well, why is it important to discuss mathematical ideas intelligently if you're not able to solve them? Because I know a lot of students have that question, right? I mean, that's what I always said in high school. I said, why do I have to take math? I'm like, I know I'm not going to major in math in college, and I don't want to take calculus. And and later on I learned the idea of, well, what does it mean to think mathematically, and how can that help you in other areas of life, even if you're not going to be a mathematician or even a math major? I'm sure there are much better answers to that question than I could provide here, but that's sort of the thinking here. Data analytics, nice. Very cool, Benjamin. Catherine, I like that. Anthropological thinking. I did this workshop once and a sociologist said, I just want students to be able to leave my course recognizing that they're not the only person in the universe. Using evidence, very good. All right, you all are doing a great job with this. And like I said, I want to make sure we have enough time to go through the rest of this, but this is going to be the crucial step before the final step of coming up with your learning goal, to think through what it is that you do in your discipline. Okay. So some of you are familiar with, Bloom's taxonomy and the idea of lower order versus higher order thinking skills. And I know I said I would sidestep the whole learning objectives versus outcomes thing, but you can't totally avoid all the jargony pedagogical stuff. So, and Bloom's has, been revised, and there are other ways to kind of consider these things. But again, it's just a shortcut for trying to kind of get students to go beyond just absorbing content and actually having practice in using that content to do something and to learn something. And so Bloom's is the one we use here, but you could just forget the name Bloom if you'd like, and just focus on the adjectives that we'll talk about in a second that describes these more higher order learning skills goals, thinking skills goals. And now, this lower order, higher order also kind of assumes like maybe that one is better than the other, and that's not it at all. It's just, I always think of lower order, and maybe you should call it foundational, right? So the lower order goals are foundational. They're important to get to the higher order, but they're insufficient on their own. All right. And so, and the higher order ones, rely on the lower order ones being achieved. But, you need to, again, by themselves, the lower order ones just don't really do much for students. And so just think of it that way. And so like that last thing, we could set higher order learning goals in courses at all levels. They are going to be different in an introductory course versus an advanced course, but you could do it in all courses. So lower order thinking skill goals, here's the list of adjectives, right? It's knowledge, comprehension, application, and it's just the kind of things you got to do, the basic knowledge generation, right? And so here's some lower order thinking skills goals. Listing, identifying, recognizing, discussing, calculating, discussing the causes, right? So it's just, and again, these things are important for all these courses. They need to be done, but they are lower order thinking skills goals, and really just reiterative, right? Things that students can just memorize and then promptly forget as soon as the course is over. Higher order thinking skills goals, are more the analysis, synthesis, evaluation, and some types of application. And so these adjectives are good for the constructing higher order thinking skills goals. And so here's some examples. And so again, a lot of it is, you could see that these examples all involve a kind of a process, right? It's not, there's multiple steps here, and it's not just memorization alone is not going to cut it, right? To do any of these things well in any of your courses, students are going to need practice, they're going to need feedback, and they can't just cram to do pretty much any of this stuff. It needs to be something that's built into the whole course or into a significant assignment. So here's just some more examples. So these goals are analytical, not reiterative. As I just said before, they're analytical in that you have to kind of pull them apart. You have to, it's a process of understanding how to achieve them that, needs practice, that needs, feedback that you can't, again, just memorize. And then, the focus is on new and different situations. So these are all, if you go back to them, they're things that you could do, develop and test age appropriate lesson plans, right? So age appropriate, what does that mean? Okay, well, who are my students? Okay, are they children? Are they adults? Are they teenagers, right? So it's, you're going to follow those or learn those goals or achieve those goals. It's going to be very context dependent. And that's why, again, I asked you to think about your context initially, because it's going to change depending upon what your context is. And so the emphasis is that your skills, abilities, knowledge, and understanding, the lower order stuff, is transitive. It's context dependent. It's dependent on time, right? So some of you are in disciplines where the knowledge, those of you studying viruses, right? Our understanding of viruses change year to year, and moment to moment. And so these type of learning goals take into account the transitive nature of skills, abilities, knowledge, and understanding. And then lastly, there's different paths and benchmarks for all these goals, right? So, you wouldn't expect, for example, someone evaluating the historical context in an unfamiliar event at an introductory level to sort of dig into primary sources and maybe go to a museum or travel and do the kind of stuff a professional historian would do. But maybe they would step back and do some internet research to evaluate the historical context of an unfamiliar event. But they're not going to do as much work as a professional historian, right? So it's the benchmarks for what counts to achieve those goals are going to change depending upon the course level and ultimately what they're going to accomplish at the end of the process. So again, here's just some more examples. And this is what I was saying before, that there are, again, the lower order thinking skills I should probably redefine them as foundational thinking skills, because they are typically embedded in ones involving higher order thinking skills. So this is one from my course I don't teach anymore. I used to teach Introduction to Political Theory and Political Thought at Brockport. But I always was so focused on having them learn the theories that I never thought about, well, what are these theories any good for someone who's not going to go on and be a political theorist? And so I said, oh yeah, well, they can think about issues and things going on in the world once they have read these classics of political theory. And so here's another one from one of my classes, class I actually just taught this semester, Democratic Philosophies of Education. I wanted students to understand that, they can use democratic philosophies of education to better understand current educational policies and practice. So Susan has a good question. Where does learning how to create hypotheses, formulate a plan, or create a new model fit in the overall program? Should be part of every course or a separate course? So my opinion is that, that these higher order thinking skills goals should be part of every course at the appropriate level, right? And so, you shouldn't, to me, the research, if research is an important component of your discipline, there shouldn't just be one course for students called research methods. It should be throughout. And in fact, Binghamton University has done this with their CURE program, their undergraduate research courses, where they have significant research components to their introductory, I believe, biology courses. And so, I think it's unreasonable to sort of segment things and say, okay, here you learn the foundations, and then later you learn the application, because time passes and they forget the foundations. And that's what everybody in the more advanced courses complain about, right? Like, they were supposed to learn this in the other course, but they learned it out of the context of how it was used. So, my opinion is that it all needs to be integrated ideally, right? Obviously, and again, but it's developmental. So you start out with little projects and then you just advance, and then you're kind of constantly practicing and that sort of thing. So, yeah. All right. So the other one, it's hard to avoid, are the abstract goals, right? And so you might, and then I think we're all sort of, once we get to this place of saying, okay, we want to do more than just have students memorize content, then we kind of like, oh, I want them to change the world, and that's great. But it's not always something that, again, we're talking about goals here, so they have to be time bound and measurable, right? Or if you think of the SMART acronym, specific, measurable, achievable, what's the R? It's not realistic. It's relevant to you and your interest, and then time bound. So, you want to create SMART goals, and abstract goals are great, but how do you assess the students appreciating the complexity of political systems or thinking like political scientists, right? You just hard to assess those. All right, so these goals meet our criteria. I want to expose my students to the history of economic thought. No. Poverty is a complex issue. Okay, again, that's how do you assess that? I want my students to be able to identify rocks and minerals. Identify, no. And then finally, students be able to apply their knowledge of statistics to analyze reports and claims in the popular press. So that's kind of what we're looking for. All right, so like I said, I know this might be, hopefully you guys will have a chance to do this after the workshop today. Obviously, maybe not at 11 if you're going to attend the next one, but this is what your next task is to do, is to set some student focused goals for your class, and then answer the question, what do I want my students to be able to do in place of, I want my students to use their strong background in something in order to do something, rather than I want my students to just have that strong background just because I think it's a good thing. So that is the link to the second worksheet that you talked about what you do as someone in your discipline. There are prompts there that talk about your overarching goals and how to set them up. The other thing too, and I say this to folks all the time, the fewer goals, the better. I usually have 2 in my classes. I don't know. It just seems to be, but I know others have just said there's one thing. If you're able to do this one thing in my course, that's great. And others really push 3, and some say, oh, well, there are 5 things. And usually when people have 5 things, I say, well, you probably have things that are those lower order goals that could be kind of folded into some of those other goals as ways to achieve the higher order goals. All right. And then there's just no one right set of overarching goals for any particular course topic. And that's why I said earlier, this is something that will help you make your course uniquely yours. And so you could have 2 different courses, the same courses with 2 different sort of overarching goals. And they could be completely valid overarching goals for that course. So like I said, please share your goals with me for feedback if you'd like, after you have a chance to put them together. And I'll be happy to let you know what I think and what I think you could do to improve it. And we have 4 minutes, so I'm happy to entertain any questions, Jamie, unless I missed any in the chat.
No, I think you kept up pretty well.
Okay. Anybody can feel free to chime in or use their mic, or again, throw anything in the chat. But that's it. I'm done. With 3 minutes to spare.
Excellent. Thanks for stepping in, Chris. Really
Sure.
appreciate it. I think this was very, very helpful. I think everybody is agreeing in the chat. So thank you to everybody for joining us this morning. We're going to get started with our next session in just a couple of minutes. So if anybody needs to take, a networking break, as we would call it if we were face-to-face, please feel free to do so. And Pamela, do you have a question, or David? You guys are just applauding the need for a networking break. Okay, great. So we'll get started in just a minute with our next session, how to, when, and when not to record videos for your courses.
So Jamie, somebody had asked about the recordings, so I just put up the last slide so they know where the recordings and the PowerPoint will be.
And would you put your email address in the chat too, please?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
For the presentations yesterday, we have 2 of them, I think, ready to go. The other 2, I just have to make them accessible because of all the poll questions that got asked. It's going to take me a little bit of time, but we'll get those up to you as well.
Stop the recording for this and then restart it. Is that how you do it?
That's smart, Chris. Thanks.